There are many opinions and thoughts surrounding the morality and legality of sharing music and media in general over the internet. Some perceive it as a simple, punishable crime, some as a slight to an art form, some as an undermining of any and all previous media business models. Yet many see it as less of a crime and more of an opportunity. It's a way to force change and progression in an archaic business model that abuses those who produce the goods it sells. Or they see it as simply a more convenient means to an end. A way to get the media they want to consume in a way that's much, much easier. And obviously cheaper. From an economic perspective, stealing a CD is quite different from downloading an MP3 off the internet. Firstly, an MP3 being on the internet itself necessitates at least one person buying a physical copy of the music being reproduced. Now, they then go on to rip the media off of that CD and compress it into an MP3 format and then distribute it off a peer-to-peer network, all of which have questionable legality surrounding it. But at the end of the day, a legitimate exchange began the entire process. Secondly, and more importantly, one must remember that a CD itself has a very long road to travel before it is being purchased at a music store, and even more of a road to travel after it's purchased from a music store. Or at least, when CDs were still a thing, that was true. Distributing and selling CDs is something that takes an enormous investment. Beyond the actual production and marketing of the music contained on it, the process of producing thousands or even millions of CDs is a significant investment, with a huge amount of sunk costs already associated with it. Never mind the cost of distributing said CDs around the country or even the world. And once all of that is factored in, the profit margin of a CD has obviously dwindled as time went on, as inflation itself has also increased, which in turn necessitates higher prices. In the year 2000, CDs are being sold at a higher rate than ever before. Nearly 1 billion CDs were sold in 2000, and the production of these CDs, therefore, has to be in the billions, if not the tens of billions of dollars. And because of this, the revenue required from it must also be in the billions of dollars, or tens of billions of dollars, more so than the actual costs, given the fact that these companies must be profitable and the artists do, in fact, have to be paid. Therefore, by the 2000s, CDs are being sold for $20 per unit, or something around that, a portion of which went to the record label, which fronted the cost of production and distribution of said CDs. A smaller portion went to the artist, and another portion went to the physical store where the unit was being purchased. The physical sale of the CD itself then directly influenced the revenue stream of 3 separate individual entities. Therefore, the theft of a single CD directly cut into the revenue stream of those 3 separate individual entities. Therefore, to attempt to compare that with sharing of a purchased CD over peer-to-peer networks is obviously somewhat of a fallacy. One cannot in good faith make the claim that every user of that network who downloaded that music would have absolutely gone and bought the CD physically. The mere fact they were trying to find it on the internet would seemingly negate that argument entirely. Furthermore, these individuals did not steal a physical product, which had to be manufactured and distributed, one that had to be invested in by the record label and then bought in bulk by a brick-and-mortar store, so on and so forth. The comparison of those two is then, by definition, somewhat illogical. Not to say that there isn't an element of theft to it, but to say that it is directly comparable to a physical CD being stolen does not completely add up. Furthermore, the people who were initially tasked with defining the crime of internet piracy in general did not have the basic understanding of how either the music industry or the internet and peer-to-peer networks truly functioned. This can be seen by the pretty profound glossary definitions required in all of the legal cases surrounding corporations like Napster, where things like MP3s, peer-to-peer networks, so on and so forth had to be defined exhaustively in a way that a jury of non-experts would be able to understand what was going on in any way. Beyond all of this, it's necessary to look beyond the immediate effects to the industry that organizations like Napster had. The convenience of online piracy made an immediate impact on how people looked at accessing media. it essentially forced a paradigm shift in the way music was distributed and media in general. Streaming services wouldn't begin for another few years, but this was definitely the impetus for that revolution in media sharing. Because as soon as internet piracy became even remotely accessible to the average individual, Pandora's box had been opened. And an industry, or really industries, that had run on essentially the same business model for a century were suddenly forced into a situation they had not planned for. They had not even begun to plan for. And they fought. They fought, and to them they may have succeeded because they tore down industries like, or corporations like Napster and LimeWire and Kazaa and made them into shadows of their former selves. But at the end of the day, they really failed. They failed to adapt. They failed to recoup the success of physical media, and eventually had to relegate themselves to doing the same thing that these businesses had already been doing, sharing. This change did not only happen in the music industry. You can look at all electronic forms of media. I mean, physical art, visual art is nigh on impossible to stop the reproduction of physical visual art over the internet. Images are very easily shared. You can find copies of incredibly famous pieces of art that are worth millions of dollars on Google. You don't even have to go to peer-to-peer networks. You could find it simply, easily, legally, distributed legally. Now, Picasso's estate is not being paid for every copy, every print of his artwork now being distributed. It'd be impossible. Does that make it correct? Not necessarily. However, what it showcases is that now that we have the internet, and now that we have this ability to distribute media freely and conveniently, it is not on the consumer to continue to use old-fashioned forms of buying and consuming when there's a much easier, more convenient manner of doing so available elsewhere. That's simply competition. And just because there's a questionable legality to it does not mean that businesses should not adapt to it. And so the turn of the century set of legal proceedings that followed the development of programs like Napster showcased a fight between an old-fashioned form of business and a new revolutionary form of business. There's a whole other argument to be made about the ethics of either of those businesses. However, at the end of the day, from an economic perspective, from a capitalism perspective, it's difficult to argue against the validity of internet distribution of media, simply because without incredibly overarching and what some might say tyrannical control over the media being shared on the internet, it's going to happen. And it is on the companies to adapt to it, not on the consumer.